Commander Vrix of the Zilrathi expedition stood in the center of the humans' living quarters, his elongated fingers clasped behind his back. The mission had been simple: observe Earth's dominant species and assess their compatibility with the galactic concord. Humans were unpredictable, but manageable. Their pets, however, were a different story. You are certain this creature follows commands? Vrix's translucent eyes flicked toward the human standing before him. Jonas Reed, a biologist assigned as the expedition's liaison, shifted uncomfortably. It depends. Vrix's brow ridges twitched. Explain. Jonas sighed. Cats don't take orders. They do what they want, when they want. Vrix tilted his head. All sentient creatures respond to hierarchical structure. Domesticated subordinates obey their superiors. Jonas glanced down at the small, fluffy perpetrator of this impending galactic incident. Her name was Pickles, an orange tabby with a permanent look of disdain. She sat on the armrest of the couch, tail flicking, green eyes half-lidded with disinterest. Vrix extended a spindly hand toward her. Demonstrate its compliance. Jonas hesitated. Okay, but don't expect much. He crouched slightly. Pickles, come here. Pickles blinked at him. Vrix's ridges tensed. Perhaps the command was unclear. Issue a direct order. Jonas sighed. Pickles, come here. Now. Pickles stretched, yawned, then leapt off the couch, but not toward Jonas. Instead, she strolled over to Vrix, rubbed against his leg, and then, with calculated malice, sank her claws into his ankle. Vrix let out a sharp, clicking sound and recoiled. It attacked me. Jonas winced. Yeah, she does that. Vrix inspected his wound, thin greenish fluid seeping from the punctures. Explain this behavior. She doesn't like being told what to do. Vrix narrowed his eyes at Pickles, who had already curled into a ball on the floor, looking utterly at peace. Your species considers this disobedience acceptable. Jonas exhaled. It's not about acceptance. Cats operate on their own terms. You can't force them. Vrix straightened, his wounded foot hovering slightly. That contradicts the fundamental principles of domestication. Yeah, well, cats didn't get the memo. Vrix paced slightly, his usual grace disrupted by his injury. His species prided itself on control, on structure. The idea that humans coexisted with creatures that refused to acknowledge authority was unsettling. How do you maintain order? Jonas hesitated. You don't. You just coexist. Vrix's hand twitched. This undermines the very foundation of structured civilization. Jonas chuckled. Welcome to life with a cat. Vrix exhaled sharply. I must report this anomaly. It may affect our assessment of your species. Jonas frowned. Because of a cat. This lack of obedience suggests a deeper incompatibility with structured governance. Jonas crossed his arms. So what? You're going to tell the Galactic Concord that humans are unfit for interstellar relations because we have independent pets. Vrix hesitated. It raises concerns. Jonas knelt beside Pickles and scratched her chin. She purred, the sound rich and content. You're overthinking this. Vrix observed closely. The creature accepts physical contact now. Why? Jonas smirked. Because she wants to. Vrix's ridges twitched again. That is irrational. Welcome to Earth. Vrix turned toward the door. I must consult with my superiors. Jonas watched him limp slightly. Might want to get that looked at. Cat scratches can get infected. Vrix paused. Your species tolerates creatures capable of biological warfare. Jonas laughed. I wouldn't call it that. But yes, sometimes cats scratch, sometimes they bite. But we keep them anyway. Vrix shook his head. This requires further observation. Jonas grinned. Good luck. Pickles flicked an ear, unimpressed by the entire conversation. Vrix stood in the medical bay of the Zilrathi vessel, watching as the ship's physician, Dr. Relic, examined the wounds on his ankle. The greenish fluid had congealed, but the area around the punctures was inflamed. Vrix's tendrils flicked in quiet disapproval as he applied a sterilizing agent. The air in the bay carried the crisp scent of antiseptics, and the hum of diagnostic tools filled the space. Vrix remained still, his mind turning over the encounter with the human's creature. It had acted with complete disregard for structure, yet its human caretaker had accepted this as normal. That alone warranted deeper investigation. Vrix's voice broke the silence. "How did you sustain this injury?" Vrix hesitated. "A domesticated earth creature inflicted it." Vrix paused. "A trained subordinate attacked you." Vrix's ridges tensed. "It does not adhere to conventional structures. It acts on impulse." Vrix studied him, and the human allowed this. He claimed it was standard behavior. Vrix's tendrils curled slightly, a sign of contemplation. "Then this species tolerates disorder within its own dwellings." Vrix exhaled sharply. "It appears so." Vrix completed the treatment and retracted his instruments. "I will monitor for further complications. This species carries microbial agents unlike our own." Vrix nodded, then turned toward the exit. There was only one logical course of action: return to the human's dwelling and observe this creature further. When he arrived at Jonas Reed's quarters, the human was seated at a console, reviewing data streams. The feline lounged atop the desk, tail twitching in lazy arcs. Vrix stepped inside with measured control, keeping his distance from the creature. Jonas glanced up. "Did the medics clear you?" Vrix inclined his head. "They administered treatment. However, I require further observation of this creature." Jonas leaned back slightly. "What exactly are you trying to understand?" Vrix gestured toward the feline. "Its behavioral patterns defy logic. I must determine whether this is an anomaly or indicative of a broader issue." Jonas exhaled through his nose. "You're going to have a hard time getting a straight answer out of a cat." Vrix's ridges twitched. "That remains to be determined." He moved closer, watching as the feline stretched, then rolled onto her side. The movement seemed calculated yet entirely unconcerned with his presence. Vrix narrowed his eyes. "It lacks fear." Jonas scratched his jaw. "Cats don't really do fear the way you'd expect. They're cautious, but they decide when to care about something." Vrix considered this. "Then it does not recognize threats." Jonas shook his head. "Oh, it recognizes them. It just decides if they're worth reacting to." Vrix studied the feline's relaxed posture. It showed no sign of weariness, no acknowledgement of his presence as a potential risk. That defied the logic of lesser creatures. Even undomesticated animals exhibited a survival instinct in unfamiliar situations. He extended a hand slightly. The feline's ear flicked, but it did not move. Vrix hesitated, then reached further. With a swift motion, the feline swatted his hand, claws extended just enough to graze his skin. He withdrew immediately. Jonas let out a quiet chuckle. "Yeah, that means back off." Vrix flexed his fingers, inspecting the minor scratch. "It establishes boundaries through force." Jonas nodded. "More like communication. Cats don't really have a hierarchy like you're thinking. They just set rules for themselves and expect you to follow them." Vrix processed this. "Then it perceives itself as an equal." Jonas shrugged. "More or less." Vrix straightened. "This creature's behavior contradicts fundamental principles of domestication. If your species tolerates such defiance, how do you maintain structure?" Jonas leaned forward, arms resting on the desk. "You're thinking about it wrong. It's not about control, it's about coexistence. We don't command cats, we live with them." Vrix's ridges tensed again. The concept was foreign to him. Every species within the galactic concord understood structure, hierarchy, obedience. Yet this was something else entirely. He exhaled slowly. "Then I must observe further." Jonas shook his head, amused. "Good luck with that." The feline stretched again, eyes half-lidded, utterly indifferent to the scrutiny. Vrix stood motionless as the feline stretched out one paw, pressing it against the side of his leg without looking at him. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it carried an undeniable sense of ownership. He was being claimed. Jonas watched from his chair, arms crossed. Looks like she's decided you're acceptable. Vrix did not move. What does this signify? Jonas scratched behind his ear. Hard to say. Cats do things for their own reasons. Could be curiosity, could be that she thinks you're warm. Vrix remained tense. It is not an act of submission. Jonas laughed under his breath. No, definitely not. The feline withdrew her paw and flicked her tail once before shifting into a loaf-like posture, eyes closing as if Vrix's presence no longer warranted attention. He observed the motion closely. There was no evident strategy, no discernible intent beyond comfort. The creature had evaluated him and made its decision based on criteria he could not determine. Vrix lowered himself onto the nearest chair, his movements slow and deliberate. This behavior is inconsistent. It disregards conventional patterns of domestication yet does not display hostility. It exhibits independence but chooses proximity. Jonas leaned back. Yeah, that's a cat. Vrix's ridges tightened. This does not align with known models of cooperative species. Jonas shrugged. Maybe because cats aren't cooperative in the way you expect. Vrix tapped his fingers against the armrest. Then explain how your species maintains long-term companionship with such creatures. Jonas considered this for a moment. You don't maintain it like you would with a trained animal. It's more like an agreement. You provide food, shelter, care. In return, a cat decides if it wants to be around you. It's mutual, but on their terms. Vrix's eyes narrowed slightly. Then it is not a subordinate. Jonas exhaled through his nose. Nope. Vrix turned his gaze back to the feline, who had begun grooming a paw with slow, deliberate licks. Yet your species continues to accept their presence. Jonas nodded. Because we like them. Vrix processed this. The concept of tolerating an entity that provided no direct service, followed no orders, and dictated its own engagement was entirely foreign. Every cooperative species he had encountered maintained structure, even within symbiotic relationships. But this was something else. The feline paused its grooming and blinked at Vrix, its gaze unreadable. He resisted the urge to shift under its scrutiny. Then, with no discernible reason, it rose, stretched, and leapt onto Jonas's lap, curling into a tight ball. Vrix leaned forward slightly. It has chosen proximity to you. Jonas nodded. Yep. Vrix observed closely. What causes this selection? Jonas shrugged. Comfort, familiarity. Maybe she just likes sitting here. Vrix tilted his head. There is no pattern. Jonas shook his head. Not one you can predict. Vrix sat back, exhaling slowly. This would require significant reevaluation. His understanding of domestication of interspecies relationships did not account for creatures that operated entirely by their own will while still being accepted as companions. Jonas scratched the feline's head absent-mindedly. You're trying to fit cats into a system they don't belong to. They don't follow a structured hierarchy, but they're still part of our lives. You're looking for logic, but it's not about that. Vrix remained silent for a long moment, then finally spoke. Then, what is it about? Jonas's expression softened slightly. Trust. Vrix considered this. The feline did not obey, did not submit, yet humans still allowed them into their homes, cared for them, and accepted their unpredictable nature. Not out of necessity, but because they chose to. He leaned back, watching as the feline's tail twitched in sleep. This would require further study. Vrix sat in the observation chamber of his vessel, reviewing the data collected from his time in the human's dwelling. The feline's behavioral patterns remained inconsistent, defying standard models of domestication. Every documented companion species in the galactic concord adhered to hierarchical structures, yet these creatures operated outside such systems entirely. His console displayed footage recorded from his ocular implant, the feline's disregard for direct commands, its unpredictable shifts in behavior, its apparent selection process for interaction. The data was inconclusive. There was no universal pattern of response. Even conditioning through reward did not guarantee compliance. His ridges tensed as he activated the communication link. High Administrator Zorik's image materialized, his expression measured. Vrix composed himself before speaking. The human species maintains a companion animal that does not conform to hierarchical models. Zorik's gaze sharpened. Elaborate. Vrix hesitated. The creature exists within human dwellings, yet it does not acknowledge commands or structured behavioral reinforcement. It operates by its own volition, engaging with humans selectively. Zorik's tendrils curled slightly, a sign of intrigue, and yet they continue to coexist. Vrix inclined his head, with apparent contentment. Zorik remained silent for a long moment. This contradicts known models of interspecies relationships. Vrix exhaled slowly, precisely. The implications suggest an acceptance of unpredictability within human culture that extends beyond standard domestication. Zorik studied him. Have you determined the rationale? Vrix hesitated. The human claims it is based on mutual trust rather than control. Zorik's tendrils twitched. Trust in a creature that does not reciprocate structured behavior. Vrix nodded. It exhibits no obligation, yet the humans persist in their association. Zorik considered this. Continue your observations. This may indicate a fundamental divergence in human psychology. The transmission ended, leaving Vrix alone with his thoughts. The inquiry had yielded no definitive answers, only more uncertainty. He would need to return to the human's dwelling for further study. When he arrived, Jonas was seated on the floor, a small mechanical device in his hands. Pickles sat nearby, tail flicking as she observed him. Vrix stepped inside, watching as the human manipulated the object, which emitted a small red dot onto the floor. Pickles' pupils dilated, and in an instant she lunged, swiping at the dot. The movement was precise, yet as soon as her paw made contact, the dot remained unchanged. She hesitated, then struck again. The dot darted across the floor, and she pursued it with sudden intensity. Vrix observed closely. It engages in predatory behavior despite the absence of tangible prey. Jonas nodded. Yeah, it's a hunting instinct. Even if there's nothing to catch, the drive is still there. Vrix watched as Pickles leapt forward, paws skidding slightly as she adjusted her trajectory. Yet it does not appear frustrated by its inability to capture the target. Jonas chuckled. She knows she's not catching anything. It's just fun for her. Vrix's ridges tightened. It acknowledges futility but continues regardless. Jonas tossed the device onto the table. Yeah. It's about the chase, not the catch. Vrix processed this. The feline understood that its actions would not yield results, yet it engaged in them anyway. It was not driven by necessity or command, but something else entirely. Pickles sat back, licking a paw, as if the game had never happened. The abrupt shift in focus was almost unsettling. Vrix exhaled slowly. This behavior is inconsistent with standard patterns of motivation. Jonas leaned back. Maybe you're looking for logic where there isn't any. Vrix studied the feline, its gaze now settled elsewhere, as if it had already dismissed the previous activity from its mind. There was no discernible strategy, no prolonged contemplation, just action, then indifference. He would have to reevaluate everything. Vrix sat across from Jonas in the dim glow of the human's living quarters, his gaze fixed on the feline curled atop a stack of books. Its tail twitched lazily, the only sign it was aware of their presence. The past cycles of observation had yielded nothing resembling a predictable pattern. Every attempt to analyze the creature's behavior only led to further contradictions. The feline demonstrated awareness of its environment, yet disregarded any imposed structure. It engaged with its human without apparent obligation, yet its actions suggested a selective form of attachment. Jonas leaned back in his chair, watching Vrix study Pickles with the same intensity he had since his arrival. Vrix exhaled through his nasal slits. This creature does not operate within any defined behavioral framework. Jonas rested his chin on one hand. You're still trying to fit her into a system that doesn't apply. Vrix's fingers tapped against his armrest. Then, what governs its decisions? Jonas considered the question. Instinct, mood, maybe something we don't fully understand. Cats just do what feels right to them in the moment. Vrix's ridges tightened. This lack of consistency renders prediction impossible. Jonas nodded. Exactly. Vrix's tendrils curled slightly, and your species does not find this untenable. Jonas shrugged. We don't need to control everything to live with it. Vrix studied him. That sentiment was at odds with most intelligent species. Predictability was the foundation of cooperative existence. Yet humans accepted a living entity into their dwellings without any certainty of its reactions. That suggested a tolerance for unpredictability far greater than most sentient species possessed. Pickles stretched, then rolled onto her back, paws curled toward her chest. The movement was deliberate, yet held no apparent purpose beyond comfort. Vrix's gaze remained fixed on her. It displays vulnerability without assurance of safety. Jonas glanced at the cat. Yeah, that means she trusts you. Vrix's ridges twitched. Trust, despite my inability to provide for its needs. Jonas scratched his jaw. Trust isn't always about what you provide. Sometimes it's just about feeling safe around someone. Vrix processed this. The feline had determined he was not a threat, not based on command structure or enforced familiarity, but something more abstract. It had come to its own conclusion, independent of any external reinforcement. Pickles let out a slow, contented exhale, completely at ease. Vrix clasped his fingers together. This contradicts fundamental models of cooperative engagement. Jonas sighed. Then maybe your models need updating. Vrix remained silent for a long moment. The feline did not conform to his understanding of interspecies relationships. It was neither subordinate nor indifferent. It was something else entirely, a creature that coexisted without obligation, that chose companionship without expectation. The implications were unsettling. If humans could accept such unpredictability within their own homes, what did that say about their capacity for adaptation? He exhaled slowly. This requires further consideration. Jonas smirked slightly. Take your time. She's not going anywhere. Pickles flicked an ear but otherwise remained motionless, as if entirely unconcerned with the weight of the discussion surrounding her. Vrix stood near the observation panel of the human's dwelling, hands clasped behind his back. Jonas sat at the table, idly scrolling through data on his console while Pickles sprawled across his lap, her tail flicking intermittently. The feline had claimed her space without hesitation, and Jonas had simply adjusted around her. Vrix had spent cycles cataloging behavior, analyzing interactions, and attempting to reconcile the feline's actions with his understanding of structured coexistence. Yet the conclusions remained elusive. The creature operated beyond the limits of logic-driven analysis. Jonas exhaled through his nose. You've been staring for a while. Vrix's gaze remained fixed on Pickles. I have exhausted conventional methods of study. This creature defies categorization. Jonas glanced down at the cat. You say that like it's a bad thing. Vrix's ridges tensed. It challenges fundamental principles of structured species interaction. If a species tolerates unpredictability within its own dwellings, it suggests a capacity for adaptation beyond standard parameters. Jonas leaned back slightly. Is that a problem? Vrix hesitated. It is an anomaly. Your species accepts creatures that do not adhere to order, yet you still maintain stability. That contradicts established models of cooperative existence. Jonas scratched at his jaw. Maybe because cooperation doesn't always mean control. Vrix turned toward him fully. Then by what mechanism does your species maintain cohesion? Jonas considered for a moment. It's not about structure. It's about understanding that not everything needs to be controlled to be valuable. Cats aren't predictable, but we don't need them to be. We accept them for what they are. Vrix processed this. That level of tolerance suggests a capacity to coexist with systems beyond your own. Jonas nodded. Probably why we've managed to integrate with so many different species so far. Vrix's ridges flexed slightly. Then this behavior is not an outlier. It is a reflection of broader adaptability. Jonas shrugged. Maybe, or maybe we just like having them around. Pickles stretched, pressing her paws into Jonas's leg before settling again. Vrix observed the motion, noting the complete lack of hesitation. The feline had no fear of rejection, no expectation of consequence. It simply existed within the space it had chosen. Vrix exhaled slowly. I must report my findings. Jonas arched an eyebrow. And what exactly are you going to tell them? Vrix considered his words carefully. That human species tolerates unpredictability within its own environment, that they coexist with entities beyond direct command structure and still maintain stability, that this suggests a capacity for integration beyond hierarchical limitations. Jonas smiled slightly. That sounds like a good thing. Vrix inclined his head. It is an unexpected variable, but not a detrimental one. Jonas scratched under Pickles' chin, eliciting a deep, rumbling purr. So what happens now? Vrix straightened. My superiors will consider the implications, but I suspect this will reflect favorably on your species. Jonas chuckled. Because of a cat. Vrix's gaze flicked to Pickles. Because of what it represents. Jonas shook his head, amused. Well, I'm sure she'll be thrilled to hear it. Pickles let out a slow blink before curling tighter into her spot, utterly unconcerned with the diplomatic impact of her existence. Vrix observed her for a moment longer before turning toward the exit. The data was complete. The conclusions had been drawn. And for the first time since he had arrived, he accepted that not everything needed a structured answer. As he stepped through the door, he heard Jonas's voice behind him. Hey, if you ever want to observe more cat behavior, you know where to find us. Vrix paused, then nodded once. I will consider it. And with that, he left, his mind turning over the unexpected revelation that sometimes the absence of control was not a weakness, but a strength.